Hello, everybody. Oh, quality doesn't look very good there. Hopefully, the audio is at least reasonable. I seem to have issues with YouTube. Look, as I said in my rather long title and description, I wanted to talk for a little while about the Ashes, and I'm going to start with Tim Paine's situation, I guess we'll call it. I mean, before the Ashes began, before that whole thing started, my thought was about the Afghanistan tour, the one that was meant to be coming. I mean, we were meant to be playing in Hobart, a single test against Afghanistan, and it was meant to be one test, and I think three T20s perhaps, and that would have been after the T20 World Cup. It was rather hastily arranged in between the T20 World Cup, which finished 3 weeks ago, and the Ashes, which are starting next week. So would have been just slotted in there. And that would have been a historic first ever test match between Afghanistan and Australia. Having Afghanistan come to Australia, a big deal. Look, Afghanistan would have lost. I don't think there's really any doubt about that. The gap between the two sides is pretty big. Afghanistan improving, and on their day they could perhaps win a T20 against Australia, maybe. And you could imagine an ODI that Afghanistan could win in the right circumstances, but a test match was never really likely to be even very close. And so anyone who's thinking, oh, Australia cancelled it because they were scared, they just don't really understand the gap between the two teams. It's quite different between that and Australia going to Bangladesh and thinking that we might lose against Bangladesh because Bangladesh have been doctoring their pitches like crazy. And I mean, we did lose to Bangladesh in Bangladesh, and still that's quite humiliating for us, since generally speaking, we're quite a lot worse than Bangladesh. And look, if we did play in Afghanistan, I'd imagine that it would be a different scenario. I don't know the quality of grounds there, but it'd be quite difficult. But anyway, that one was not cancelled for that reason. It was cancelled for political reasons. And there was the talk, there was some deputy minister for cultural affairs, not even cricket. It wasn't for cricket, it wasn't for sport, it was for cultural affairs. And he said in an interview about something completely different. I think the interview was about how the Taliban viewed Australian soldiers going to Afghanistan. And he was asked, if they expressed any ill will towards Australia. And there was some comment that they said, well, they didn't like that Australia, who's been allied with Afghanistan for almost 200 years now, our camels in Australia are from Afghanistan originally, from 1830 or something like that. Got a GAN railroad going from Adelaide to Darwin, all the way south to north of our country. And that's named after the Afghans that helped, and we've been great friends with Afghanistan, one of our closest allies. And so they feel very betrayed by having Australian soldiers going to Afghanistan, being their allies. And even though we don't talk about Afghanistan very much in Australia, in a lot of ways we are closer to Afghanistan than we are to USA. So they felt very betrayed by that. But then they were asked, well, what will the cricket be like? And they said, oh, no, we're happy with the cricket going ahead. And then after that, we're asked, well, what about women's cricket? And they said, well, this cultural affairs guy who knew about, had some knowledge of the political situation and how Afghans felt about Australia, had no idea about cricket. And he just was asked, oh, what do you think about women's cricket? And the guy said, oh, he didn't see how they could play because under Muslim dress codes, you'd have to be covered up so much, and he just didn't see the point. And of course, he was ill-educated about that because, in actual fact, under the previous regime, women's cricket had been played to an extent. And in fact, other Muslim countries, which perhaps not quite as strict as the Taliban, but like Bangladesh, Pakistan, and other Muslim countries, which I can't think of who else they are offhand, but they have cricket teams for women and they adjust to those cultural needs. So it was really quite an ignorant discussion. And the fact is that the Taliban haven't banned women's sports. Now, they do put restrictions on women, and one restriction that I've heard of is that under the current regime is that they've separated or boys and girls classrooms, and where they have mixed learning, they have a curtain between them, and they had them travelling in separate buses. So they have that. And look, under the previous regime, the one in 1996, of course, Afghanistan didn't let women go to work or have normal jobs. And they, in fact, banned all sports. So it wasn't women's sports, it was all sports. And this is where we've got this inaccurate discussion on our end that we think, oh, it was women's sports who were banned. Actually, they didn't let any sports happen. And in fact, in place of their sports stadiums, they had public execution places. So for people thinking that they were picking on women's sports, that's really not accurate. And they were picking on women to the extent that women weren't allowed to work, but sport is different to working. And of course, they've said under the new regime that they're not going to be as harsh and they're not going to be as strict, and they're going to be more in line with how other Muslim countries operate, such as Pakistan and Bangladesh. And Pakistan and Bangladesh both have women's cricket teams that are reasonably successful. They weren't always, but they've adjusted. And Pakistan have said that, I mean, Pakistan shares a border with Afghanistan, and they've said, oh, we'll help Afghanistan to progress to having a women's cricket team. And the other thing is, Afghanistan hasn't had a women's cricket team. So, they did form a team and they played, I think, some B grade first class match or something. Can't remember which country it was in, but they haven't played a single international. So to say, oh, we're shutting down the team, that's just not accurate. They haven't got a team. They theoretically do. And look, 3 of the players fled in the wake of the Taliban coming in. They went to some other country. I can't remember which country, maybe Canada. But then they've said, oh, look, they were worried about sport, not women's sport. Sport. So for this Cricket Australia to say it's all about women's sport, that's just not accurate. It's about sport. And in fact, the Taliban have put a restriction on sport. They've banned MMA, mixed martial arts. They haven't banned cricket. And neither the current or the previous regime separated men's cricket and women's cricket. But I guess there is an argument they might because of the restrictions on women going to work or studying. So it could happen, but it hasn't at this stage. And in fact, Afghanistan Cricket Board CEO said there's no plans to restrict women's cricket. And that's the official statement. So Cricket Australia have now, well, they still cancelled it in the end. They were waiting for ICC to ban it themselves, and they in fact asked for the ICC to ban Afghanistan from the World Cup. Didn't happen, but they wanted that. They want Afghanistan to lose test status. They're going to meet. I'm not sure if they've met already. It was meant to be at the end of November, the ICC. And I've now been told that Afghanistan has a test status for their women's team, which is quite surprising since they don't have a women's team. They've been granted test status, which I think is a little bit political. And so that is hanging over Australia already. And it's already a pretty big deal. Don't talk about it that much in Australia, but it is a pretty big deal. And I guess in England, they have their big deal about the racism row. And this is somebody in Yorkshire, Azim something or other. I don't think he ever played for England, but I think he might be from Pakistani origin. And there were some comments that he claimed were said. And there were some Twitter messages that were supposedly said by Michael Vaughan. Of course, when he was a commentator, not when he was a player. And it's hard to follow the whole thing. Always when I look at the racism thing, I'm like, well, prove it. Because racism is one of those things that's often taken out of context. And I mean, I'm not convinced at this stage that there was definite racism. There might have been. But a lot of people often feel that they've been racially abused when they haven't, or when that wasn't the intention. And it's one of these things that you have to be very careful about. And a lot of people make these claims, and sometimes they genuinely believe them and are just, perhaps wrong. And also you often get the case where people don't genuinely believe it, but sort of use it to sort of get some advantage in some way. And so I'm very cautious about that. But look, that is hanging over the England cricket team right now. There's also, they refused to go to Pakistan as well. And that was in their case for bubble fatigue. Oh, The real reason I think we didn't want Afghanistan here was security. I think it was actually quite risky for us to bring Pakistan here. And I mean, that was a legitimate reason, but we didn't say it. Anyway, of course, Taliban probably might come with them or incite some Afghan people in Australia to attack our cricketers or members of the public. And I think that's a legitimate reason to cancel the tour. But we just lied about it, and that's an unfortunate thing. Yeah, back onto Tim Paine. So Tim Paine was meant to be captain of the series. Now, he's now resigned, originally just from the captaincy, but now he's taken an indefinite leave from the team as a whole or from all cricket. And this has happened just a week or two out. Now, the actual situation related to something in 2017 when he wasn't even playing for Australia and very rarely for Tasmania. So the situation for Tim Paine in 2017 was that he had fallen back in the ranks in Tasmania, was no longer considered their best wicketkeeper. Matthew Wade, who was at the time the Australian wicketkeeper, had moved back to Tasmania. He had left Tasmania to go to Victoria because Tim Paine was probably above him in the wicket-keeping stakes. Then Matthew Wade got above Paine. And they both played Test cricket fairly early on in their careers. So Matthew Wade was the Test wicketkeeper, decided to go back to Tasmania. And essentially when he went back to Tasmania and became captain of the Tasmanian cricket team, it hastened Tim Paine's retirement. So Tim Paine, to that point, and for most of his career, had been mainly a short format player who'd focused more on batting than wicket keeping. And in fact, his wicket keeping was generally considered to be pretty bad. Certainly not international standard. And, you know, he had support from Ian Healy, don't know why. He wasn't a very good keeper. I mean, and I think in the shorter formats, wicket keepers do need to be pretty good batsmen. And he was a very quick batsman. But then Matthew Wade worked on his batting and was ahead of him in batting as well. So there wasn't really much going for Paine. And he was saying that he was going to retire. He just wasn't getting any more opportunities in Tasmania, and there were other Tasmania wicketkeepers coming through. So when Wade was in the Australian team, Paine still wasn't the wicketkeeper. So he was like the third or fourth best wicketkeeper in Tasmania. So then he was thrust into the Test team and then suddenly was captain. Now, to understand that we have to remember, and a lot of people forget what, even from 3 or 4 years ago, particularly if they're not from Australia, Matthew Wade had lost some batting form in the Test team when he moved to Tasmania. And I think the move, you know, and he had that pressure about improving his keeping, and he did improve his keeping. So there were issues with his batting. And some people thought that he was given various chances, and they thought, well, look, this is really the final chance. We've got an Ashes. We want to consider someone else. And the thing is, so there were basically two other choices. So the first one was to go back to the previous wicketkeeper, Peter Neville. He had been quite good, but his batting wasn't very good. But he'd been a very good wicketkeeper, and he was from New South Wales. And the other choice was Alex Carey from South Australia, who had been coming on really good, also was good at batting, and his wicketkeeping was very clean. It wasn't perhaps the most exciting wicketkeeping, but he was considered to be the best wicketkeeper in the country. So they were the two other choices. So you could either stick with Wade, go back to Neville, or go on to Alex Carey. And I think when you were looking at what people were saying, they thought, well, really, Neville would be a backwards choice. And I mean, Neville, you know, he did a fairly good job for Australia, but it would be considered to be a backwards choice. You'd be having a wicketkeeper who's not batting, and we're getting rid of Wade because he's not batting when his wicketkeeping was still good. And, you know, that'd be a backward step. So it was really a choice of going to Carey or sticking with Wade. And Wade was still considered to be quite a good choice. And, of course, he was keeping wicket. He had Tim Paine in the side for one match as a batsman. And, of course, generally Paine hadn't been playing for Tasmania. He wasn't considered to be good enough. He played a couple of T20s, I think, or maybe ODIs, but he hadn't been in the first class lineup for Tasmania for quite a while. I think 2 or 3 years before that. And, yeah, so, or maybe he played a couple of matches, but he wasn't consistently there. So, yeah, he played as a batsman. And suddenly there was this talk, Tim Paine, oh, why is he playing as a batsman? He should be playing as a wicketkeeper. And they're like, why? They're saying, oh, in grade cricket, like which is a level below first class, so 2 levels below Test cricket, he's actually improved his keeping a lot. And some commentator that I'd never heard of, it was just saying, oh, Tim Paine's the best wicketkeeper in the country. I'm like, what? How can he beat the best wicketkeeper in the country when he's not even keeping for his state? And suddenly there was talk, oh, he's gonna leapfrog Carey, Wade, and Neville to become the Test wicketkeeper. I'm like, what? So he kept wicket for Tasmania for 1 match, and Wade said, all right, I'll go as a professional batsman. And Wade wanted to be in the side. Still, he was like, no, I've improved my batting. I can be a professional batsman. And then suddenly Tim Paine was in the side. And this was a massive hunch. And, sometimes hunches work. And I've heard some arguments. Some people say, oh, it wasn't a hunch, wasn't a hunch, wasn't a hunch. It was. It was an absolute hunch. If it wasn't a hunch, he would have been playing for Tasmania as a wicketkeeper the whole time. He wouldn't be nearing retirement. This was an absolute hunch. But it was one that worked. And we've got to distinguish between a hunch that works and something that's not a hunch. Carey would not have been a hunch. Carey would have been legitimate, put him in. Neville wouldn't have been a hunch. Keeping with Wade wouldn't have been a hunch. But going with Paine was a massive hunch. Now, at the same time, we also had Cameron Bancroft come in. Now, we know what happened with Cameron Bancroft with the ball tampering. But the situation with Bancroft was that he'd been injured for close to 2 years. And, nobody was talking about him. Then he came back and got a couple of centuries. I think he got 3 centuries in 2 matches on his comeback. And suddenly people are like, oh, he should be in the side. There was even talk, because he occasionally keeps wicket, they were saying, oh, he should replace Wade. It's about batting. But then they said, well, actually, the second opener, which was Matthew Renshaw. And Matthew Renshaw was in good form Test level, but he had a couple of low scores for his state. So they said, well, put Bancroft in as an opener. So they were both hunches. Now, again, I've heard people say, oh, that's not a hunch. He scored 2 centuries, 3 centuries in 2 matches. Still hadn't been playing for 2 years. He had no consistent form. A couple of good matches does not mean form. It means a couple of good matches. Form is like a whole season's worth or 2 or 3 seasons worth of good, consistently good scores, so that you're consistently doing well. I mean, at the very least, have a few months of good scores, not just a couple of matches. And look, good scores, good job. But, I mean, I didn't know if he was dropped, if they dropped catches or what they did. But anyway, so we had 2 absolute hunches. And in one sense, the wicket-keeping one was a bigger hunch. But the opening batsman, because Tim Paine was nowhere near in the first class level, let alone Test level. But the opening batsman one was also a massive hunch, because Renshaw wasn't supposed to be losing his spot. Now, of course, we know what happened with Bancroft, but look, just as a thing, is that when you have a hunch, and we often have hunches, but when you have a hunch, you give them 1 match. And if they fail in that match, you drop them. So I don't object to I do object to Bancroft a little bit, but because Renshaw shouldn't have been dropped. But I think after Bancroft, I think his first match, he got 1 bad score and then got a good score with no pressure on him. Fair enough, give him a second match. But after that, should have been dropped. But they gave him the whole 5 matches, and he failed. And I was like, well, send Renshaw to South Africa. But then they didn't want to do that, because Renshaw still wasn't scoring at first-class level. And we were in this situation where we knew we had someone that was not Test level. And he went over to South Africa and he got 3 matches. And every match, people were saying, well, why is he in the side? He's nowhere near Test level. He's not even first-class level, really. And so he was under pressure, and I think that's why he cheated. And I think it's pretty obvious that he was like, well, this helps the side. I'm unlikely to get caught, because you don't do that sort of thing thinking you're going to get caught. And he was just like, yeah, I'm doing this for the team. And I think that's why he was so angry at the captain and vice captain when he was caught. Because he was like, Smith, I did this for you. You cover me. And Smith said, yep, I'll cover you. Don't worry. I'll make sure you're okay, because I know this is a team thing. But, of course, Bancroft lied. And then, of course, Warner did the opposite. And we know Warner was trying to expose Bancroft and try to get everybody to say, well, this is the true circumstances. And then, of course, Mitchell Stark got in the way and said, hey, ban Warner. And then Warner got banned. Now, I've gone over this before. I think we've said in the media quite dishonest things about this, but I do think that Warner's response wasn't the team thing. Smith's response was the team thing, but it was naive because he trusted Bancroft, and Bancroft was lying. And I think both of them will learn from that. Look, I don't think either of them deserved to get banned for a year or all this nonsense, but Bancroft did. But I think if we go and look back at it, this was a hunch that we supported for far too long, and that's in many ways the root cause of that. There are other causes. I've gone over this before. South Africa were behaving aggressively, I guess you'd say, and they were scuffing up the ball. And I mean, some people are telling me that's not ball tampering. They were getting warned they're probably going to get a fine for ball tampering for that in that same match. And in fact, so were the Australians. And because we were running our spikes over the ball and deliberately rolling it along the ground and all that sort of stuff. So that was happening in that same match. And I mean, I know what Bancroft did with the sandpaper was much worse, much more obvious, much more deliberate. But we already were doing some things. We were, they were, we all were. We were all sort of cheating a little bit. And I think you get that complacency and you take that little step further. And he thought this is the team thing to do. But I think if he was in the side more legitimately, he wouldn't have behaved in that way. And now we look at Tim Paine, and I know a lot of background there, but Tim Paine, as we now know, shouldn't have been made captain because he had this sexting thing behind him. And we also know, well, look, it was a hunch. He did okay. He did it. But if we had picked Alex Carey to start with, we wouldn't have had this issue because, well, at least as far as I know, Alex Carey doesn't have a sexting thing in there. And, the whole thing, it was a hunch, and we shouldn't have gone for the hunch. So I said before, I'm quite happy with Pat Cummins as captain at least for the Ashes, providing he stays fit and healthy, doesn't get injured, doesn't need a rest. I'm also quite happy with Steve Smith as the vice captain, and I think that's a good transition. I'm not saying I definitely want Steve Smith as test captain straight away, but I don't think it's a bad choice. I mean, yes, Smith did stuff up with the ball tampering thing, but he didn't stuff up anywhere near as much as it was claimed he did. But yeah, I don't think he's going to just accept what someone says to him when they're lying through their teeth. I mean, had he simply got Bancroft to answer the questions himself, Smith would never have been implicated. Oh, sorry. That's a bit of asthma. Oh. Anyway, always have to explain these things nowadays. But anyway, so that's the thing that I think Smith being the vice captain is fine. I don't think he should be captain straight away, but I think if we have a transition, we see how that goes, there's a potential for him to go back up to captain. And I think the only other choice really is Labuschagne. As I said before, I think that had we gone with Alex Carey to start with and never gone with Paine would have retired. So we would have had a smoother transition. And I don't think, I mean, yes, I do think bringing Bancroft in straight up was a mistake. But he should have been in consideration. I think we should have gone with Renshaw for the first test in 2017, but with a view that if he failed, he could have been replaced. And I think that would have been a normal thing to do. And if we'd had, let's say Bancroft come in the second or third test, would have been much more legitimate. And I think had that happened, we wouldn't have had the ball tampering. And of course, had we stuck with Renshaw was never going to tamper with the ball. Could have had Joe Burns. There were other people in the mix. And, we could have gone with Kawaja opening the batting. So, there were different people, and the issue was that it was a hunch that was then persisted with in spite of no return. And we don't do that, and we shouldn't do that. So, I mean, I know that right now we've got Carey and Inglis. Now, Carey has he's got ODI and T20I experience, so international experience. I think it's about 60 matches. He's done pretty well for Australia. Josh Inglis has no international experience, but he was sent to the T20 World Cup, whilst Carey wasn't. Inglis was the backup keeper to Wade, and that was a bit of a surprise because it had always been Wade and then Carey for the last couple of years because Tim Paine, well, his batting, I suppose, wasn't good enough for that format. So Josh Inglis didn't get to play a match, and I feel bad for him. I'd love to see Josh Inglis pay a T20 or an ODI for Australia in the next year or so. I don't see him as a test keeper necessarily. I mean, he might be in the future. But, I mean, there's time to look at that. And I think having him in the squad as a backup to Carey, in case Carey might get injured or might just stuff up, might just do badly in his first test or two, it's good to have that pressure. And I think Inglis is at that quality where it's good to have him there. I mean, I'd probably, if Wade was an option, I'd be thinking it'd be a tough choice between Wade and Carey for the test spot because Wade has that test experience quite recently. In fact, he was in the test side in the last test, but suddenly he's not even in the A side. It's a bit unfair on Wade, but that's just what they did. And yeah, I think it would have been a difficult choice between Wade and Carey, but I think it's a much easier choice between Carey and Inglis. I still would have probably picked Carey ahead of Wade. And I think mainly because we're looking at the future, and I think Wade is, I'd have to check his age, but I believe he's a few years older than Carey, and he's also had a chance, and I wouldn't say failed, but he didn't do perhaps quite as well as we ideally like. And I think Carey hasn't failed so far. He's done really well internationally. In fact, he's done better internationally than he did for his state domestically. So I think if that carries through with the test format, he could be really, really good. And in fact, he could be better than Paine. And Inglis is an unknown quantity. He's a risk. It would be a hunch to pick Inglis. Not as big a hunch as picking Paine or certainly Bancroft, but it would still be a hunch. And I think right now, I don't think we should be going for hunches. I mean, I know Shane Warne said, "Oh, Inglis should play." Yeah, and there are a number of other wicket keepers going around. I think there was Josh Felipe and can't remember all the other ones, but and each state likes their own state, or sometimes people just like different ones, and it's very subjective. The wicket keeping position is always very subjective, and we do have objective ways to look at it, but we just completely ignore it most of the time. And people just say, "Oh, he did well, this guy did well," and then we look at the batting averages and all that sort of stuff, and yeah, so Carey has got a few low scores this season. So Inglis hasn't even played for 4-5 months, so 4.5 months, I believe it is. But of course, that wasn't his fault. That was because he went over to the World Cup. Well, Carey didn't. So look, Inglis is an unknown quantity, very risky. It could be great, but I think the chances are that he probably won't be very good. Whilst Carey is a known quantity, and I think chances are he'll be at least good, between good and very good. And we don't know exactly where, but he's got that experience. He's built up to it. So I would put Carey in as the test keeper, and at the same time, I would suggest that Inglis should play in Australia's next T20, and so as to encourage that, and also to have that backup working, or and maybe have Wade in as in ODIs or something. I don't know. I don't know what to do with Wade in that situation. Look, Wade was the leading dismissal taker for wicketkeepers in the World Cup, so we can't say he's bad. We often ignore statistics like that just because Ian Healy said he's bad, so therefore he's bad. Now the other question is Khawaja versus Head. Now, I think that Khawaja would be well suited to be our opening batsman, although we've already picked Marcus Harris. Now, Marcus Harris, I don't believe is in really good form right now, but he has been told he's going to be the opener. So I would have picked both Khawaja and Head. I see they're both in pretty good form. And I think sometimes we get stuck on opening batsman being a specialist position, and I think it can be, but it's not that different from being a middle order batsman. And I think someone like Khawaja, who has opened the batting, and I think Head has too in different formats, I think either of them could fulfil a role as an opener. And considering their great form and considering Harris's not that good form, I'd play both. But given that we're not allowed to, essentially, we have that difficult situation where we could play Head, and I think quite legitimately play Head. He's probably got a longer career ahead of him. Um, or we could play Khawaja, who's probably in slightly better form. Um, and then we could slide Khawaja into open if Harris stuffs up. I guess that if I look at that, number one, I'm looking at for the future. And if I'm looking at the future, I'd rather play a younger player in Head who could also bowl a bit. But I'd also have Khawaja there, perhaps looking at the opening spot to replace Harris if Harris stuffs up. And I think Harris should be given one test. No, probably two. And if he stuffs up, but bring Khawaja in as an opener. So I'd actually play Head. It is. I wouldn't mind if they went with Khawaja. I think there's certainly a merit, and I think Khawaja is in better form, but I think there's other factors as well. And I think Khawaja has been a bit inconsistent, and he's been very good and then very bad. And Head's been a lot more consistent. He's been pretty mediocre most of the time. I also see a lot of Michael Clarke in Head, and I think he's the sort of player that could go above himself. So I'd love to see Head in the side, and I know that's two South Australians, Head and Carey, but that's just how it goes. Yeah. So, and look, I think that we're going to keep an eye on Head. We'll keep an eye on Harris. We'll keep an eye on Carey, and if Head stuffs up, then we can bring Khawaja in. If Harris stuffs up, we can bring Khawaja in. And I think we've got to say Khawaja probably should be named 12th man. If Carey really, really stuffs up, we could consider Inglis, but I don't think we should. I think we should give Carey the whole 5 matches. Cummins, obviously, I think we've got to give him all of our support and give him the 5 tests and perhaps beyond that as captain. Steve Smith as vice captain, I think we should really monitor how the team react to him and also how the public does, because we need to have someone that the public supports. If the public are saying, "Oh, we will want Smith as captain," I think they should consider it. But if the public are saying, "No," I think that we've got to replace Smith with probably Labuschagne. And I know that Labuschagne isn't all that popular necessarily, but he's an option. And there's also Nathan Lyon. And Lyon, I know he's getting a bit on, but he's a spinner. He can captain quite happily, and he could be still playing when he's 40. So they're all my thoughts there. There's quite a lot of thoughts, I know, but there's quite a lot of things to go over. Now, as for England coming to Australia, how well will they go? I think at this stage, I don't really care. It's just, it'd be great to have a game. We're playing in the days of no crowds, and I know we might have crowds at some of the matches and maybe even all the matches, and we're got that uncertainty. And I don't mind. I mean, if England won, that's good for them, and there's a chance that they'll win. And I think that we've got to be realistic there. We have all these things hanging over Australia, and I think that is going to cause a lot of problem. I think that England's little racism thing, which is restricted to Yorkshire and maybe a bit of a storm in a teacup, I don't think that's going to affect them as much as our issues. So I think that our issues hanging over us, particularly to do with Tim Paine, are going to overshadow us a lot more than England's issues. I think if it had just been the Afghanistan issue, we probably would have been even with England. But the Tim Paine issue really rocks us as well. And look, I don't think the Afghanistan issue has really affected the Australian cricket team, because they're of that belief that it's all about empowering women's cricket, even though it's probably not. And that's the way that they're looking at it. And by the way, I think that Afghanistan will probably be given an ultimatum, essentially, by the ICC: either get your women's team up to scratch, and they'll give them a timeline for when they have to get to certain levels, or else the men's team will be kicked out as well. And I think Afghanistan will probably I'd expect them to do what they're asked to do. They'll negotiate a fair timeline and what they're expected to do at different points. Maybe aiming to have a proper team in 2 years, maybe for women's team. I think that's a realistic aim. I think 1 year would be a bit too quick, but 2 years. They say 2 years that they aim to have a competitive, viable women's team that then moves through the ranks and eventually up to women's test. And yeah, I think that's realistic, and they should be working with Pakistan and perhaps Bangladesh to do that. And I think that'll be supported. And I think also Australia will have to host Afghanistan again later on. I remember a few years ago we refused to go to Bangladesh, which that was supposedly a security issue, but it's probably more realistically because we thought we were going to lose. We went there and we lost. But this one, I think, was actually a security issue. So there's all that sort of stuff. But look, I still think Australia can win the Ashes, but it will be a lot tougher because of all these issues. It's pretty much a 50-50 contest now. And I mean, Ben Stokes probably coming back, Joe Root probably playing. It's going to be tough. But we'll see how we go. It might be interesting. Yeah, that's it for me. Bye-bye.